Chapter 1 The Nightwalker, Part 1. Night descended on the city like a heavy blanket. Streetlight reflected off wet asphalt, creating long, trembling shadows. The very air seemed thick, as if holding its breath. Igor walked down the empty street, feeling every drop of cold seeping through his coat collar. His footsteps echoed off the gray buildings, and in the silence even the faint creak of a door around the corner seemed loud. He always came home late. Work dragged on, and evening walks gave him a sense of solitude, freedom from the hustle and bustle. But tonight, something was different. The darkness around him seemed denser, the air heavier, and the empty streets alive. He turned around, barely noticing how he did it automatically, and spotted a human figure on the corner. Dark coat, hood hiding the face, motionless stance. Igor slowed his pace. He didn't want his heart to race, but the feeling of anxiety grew with each moment. When he stopped, the figure also shifted slightly, as if reacting to his movement. Just tired. Or someone walking by? Igor tried to calm himself. But his inner voice whispered something entirely different. There was something wrong about this figure, something strange, alien. He quickened his pace, hoping to disappear into the darkness of an alley, but with every turn, with every glance over his shoulder, the figure was there again. Igor's steps became faster, his breathing rapid. He tried to remember if he'd seen this person before, on another street or subway station, but his memory was silent. The figure followed him soundlessly, precisely mimicking his every step, like a shadow come to life in the real world. Igor turned the corner, intending to reach another street, but the figure appeared in front of him again. He felt cold down his spine, his palms grew sweaty, and his chest tightened with fear. A slight tremor ran through his body, and for the first time in many years he understood that the sense of threat was real, not imagined. He remembered hearing stories as a child about people being stalked, but never thought he'd encounter something like this. Now everything was very real. Every movement of the figure, its stillness and precise repetition of Igor's steps, created the sensation that the world around him was narrowing, turning into a trap. Igor tried to speed up. He walked in zigzags, changing routes, trying to reach the main street where the lights were brighter and there were more people. But with each minute the anxiety intensified. It seemed the city itself was closing off paths before him and the darkness was thickening, making every alley even longer and more frightening. He noticed a reflection in a store window, a silhouette in a coat standing right behind him. Igor shuddered inwardly, and when he turned around, no one was there. But the reflection continued to stand there, watching him like a living warning. His heart nearly leaped from his chest, his palms trembled, and he felt cold sweat running down his back. Igor quickened his pace, sensing that the figure was no longer simply following him, but moving in unison with his every movement, anticipating every decision. He tried to scream, to call for help, but his voice stuck in his throat. He felt the street around him had grown longer, the buildings taller, and the darkness denser, as if the night itself was supporting this figure's presence. Igor turned onto a small bridge over the river, hoping the bridge would be filled with light and people. But the bridge was empty, the streetlights flickering, and the cold wind intensified his sense of fear. Suddenly he heard footsteps behind him. No, not just footsteps, but rhythmic, precise ones, matching his own. He turned around, and again saw no one. But inwardly he felt the presence. Every breath seemed audible to the figure, every movement predictable. Igor realized this wasn't some random person, not a drunk or wanderer. This was someone or something that knew his routes, his thoughts, and his fears. Igor's heart was beating so hard it seemed it might burst out. He picked up the pace, trying not to lose heart, and headed toward the nearest subway station, the only place where he could feel safe, among people. But when he reached the street, the figure was standing at the station entrance. It didn't move, but Igor felt its gaze on him, like a cold wind piercing right through him. He understood one thing. This pursuit was only beginning, and the night wasn't over yet. Chapter 1 The Nightwalker, Part 10, Finale. Several days passed. The city lived its usual life. People hurried about their business, cars honked, storefront lights reflected on wet asphalt. Everything looked as it should look. Nothing unusual, nothing strange. Except for one thing. Sometimes, late at night, a man would appear on empty streets. He walked calmly, confidently, unhurried. Black coat, straight posture, confident stride. No one paid him any attention. Almost no one. Andrei was returning home from work. It was already late. The streets had begun to empty. He walked his usual route, listening to music in his headphones, barely noticing the world around him, until he felt it. A strange sensation. As if someone was watching. He removed one earbud, turned around. No one. Empty street. Streetlights. Shadows. Must have imagined it, he muttered and walked on. But the feeling didn't disappear. It grew stronger, heavier, as if the gaze had gotten closer. He turned the corner and saw him. A man in a black coat stood under a streetlight, motionless, too motionless. Andre slowed his pace. Something about this was wrong. Too quiet. Too precise. He took a step. The figure did too. Andre stopped. The figure stopped. His heart beat faster. "Hey, who are you?" Silence. The figure didn't answer, only tilted its head slightly. Andre felt cold down his spine. He quickened his pace, turned down another alley, entered a courtyard, looked back. No one. What the hell? He laughed nervously. But fear had already taken root inside. He walked faster, even faster, almost ran, and stopped again. Because the figure stood ahead, already there, waiting, as if it knew. No, Andre backed away. But the footsteps behind matched his. Pause. Creak. He froze. His eyes widened. He slowly turned around, empty. But the sound was there. He looked forward again. The figure was closer, much closer. And now he could see the face. Faintly, through the shadow, but he could see it. And it was a human face. Ordinary, almost familiar. Almost his own. The figure took a step. And this time, Andre wasn't moving first. He realized it immediately. His body reacted later, by a fraction of a second. But he felt it. And that was enough for the fear to begin. Real fear. Deep. Hopeless. The figure smiled. A light, barely noticeable smile. That very one. Which shouldn't be there. Andre screamed and broke into a run. Footsteps. Behind him. Rhythm. The same. Stop. Pause. Step. And repeat. Somewhere far away, in the dark streets of the city, the man in the black coat stopped, slowly turned his head, and smiled, calmly, confidently, like one who already knows the outcome. And in the storefront reflection, for a second, two silhouettes appeared, one in front, the other behind, with a slight delay. And then only one remained. And if you're walking alone at night and suddenly notice that your footsteps sound a little later than they should, don't turn around right away. First, make sure that you're really the one walking first. Chapter 1, The Night Wanderer, Part 2. Igor descended into the subway, hoping for crowds and light that might protect him. People sat in the car, absorbed in their phones and headphones. Music and conversations created the illusion of an ordinary night, but the cold sensation of being pursued wouldn't let go. He settled into a corner, watching the doors and empty platforms carefully. His heart was still beating fast. He tried to calm down, but every sound, every screech of metal, every chime of announcements in the tunnel heightened his anxiety. When the train stopped at the next station, Igor noticed her. A figure in a black coat stood at the end of the platform, motionless, like a shadow materialized from thin air. She wasn't walking toward him, but her presence felt tangible, as if the room around him had filled with cold. Igor tried to look at his fellow passengers. No one was paying attention. He blinked again, and the figure vanished. But the sensation remained. Someone was watching. Igor felt his breathing become ragged. Every movement seemed audible, every thought known to this pursuer. He stepped onto the street, hoping for the light of main roads, people, and moving cars. But even here, the figure didn't fall behind. She appeared at every intersection, in every dark alley, always slightly behind, like a shadow living its own life. Igor began noticing strange coincidences. Periodically, small objects lay on the sidewalk, cigarette butts, discarded papers, empty bottles. But if he looked back, the objects looked different, as if they'd been rearranged. Sometimes he saw footprints on the wet asphalt that matched the figure's steps, though no one was nearby. Every night, the journey home turned into a nightmare. He tried changing routes, walking through unfamiliar courtyards, hiding in parks, but the figure appeared again. As if her presence didn't depend on space, distance, or time. Igor began recording events. He made notes, time of appearance, location, details of the figure, his own sensations. He wanted to prove to himself that this was real, that he wasn't losing his mind. But every time he reread the notes, new details appeared that he didn't remember. Shadows, finger movements, an almost imperceptible smile beneath the hood. Each day his sleep grew worse. In nightmares he saw the figure in the coat standing in his room. Sometimes she repeated his movements, sometimes she did things he couldn't predict. He would wake in cold sweat, breathing labored, heart pounding, and silence filled the room. Yet it still seemed like someone was watching. One day, Igor decided to test himself experimentally. He came home earlier than usual, turned off the lights, and sat by the window. He watched the street, waiting for the figure to appear. And there, after a few minutes, he noticed movement in the shadow by the neighboring building. The figure was there again, motionless, but her gaze seemed to penetrate through the glass and look directly at him. Igor realized this wasn't an ordinary person. This wasn't just a stalker. The figure knew when he would be where, knew his habits, routes, thoughts. He couldn't determine her origin, human, shadow, supernatural being. But one thing was clear, this was a reality that couldn't be argued with. Igor's inner voice screamed, "Hide, run, find light," but he understood that running was pointless. Any street corner, any hidden place, and the figure would appear again, like a living manifestation of his fear. He remembered childhood stories about dark silhouettes and night stalkers. Back then, they seemed like tales to frighten children. Now, every detail was real. Footsteps, breathing, cold, a gaze from the darkness. He felt that night itself was participating in this nightmare. Every streetlight, every corner, every shadow instruments of the pursuer. The next morning, Igor tried to distract himself with work, friends, daily tasks. But constant anxiety had settled in his soul. Every sound behind the apartment wall, every creak of the floor reminded him that the figure hadn't disappeared with dawn. He began avoiding streets at night, refusing his usual routes. But the fear grew, and with each new night, the figure appeared closer, more menacing. Chapter 1, The Night Passerby, Part 3, Night Fell on the City Again. Igor sat in his apartment, but sleep never came. Every rustling movement in the stairwell, every sound from a creaking floorboard seemed too loud, too significant. His gaze kept drifting to the window. The street was empty, but the feeling of presence wouldn't let go. He remembered how the figure in the black coat appeared on every corner, as if it knew his routes in advance. How it disappeared and appeared again, as if playing with him. Igor's thoughts raced. Who is this? A person? Or something else? But no answer came. And with each passing day, the fear grew denser, like thick fog enveloping his mind. When he closed his eyes, the nightmares began. He saw the city, but the streetlights were dim and the buildings distorted. The figure walked behind him, matching his steps, but now it did impossible things. Appeared in places where it physically couldn't be, passed through walls, climbed onto the roof of a neighboring building. Igor would wake in cold sweat, but the feeling of being hunted never disappeared. He began checking every movement on the street, at the store, by the metro, even when going to the shop for bread. And each time the figure appeared somewhere in his peripheral vision, vanishing the moment he tried to look at it directly. Sometimes he heard quiet footsteps behind him, barely audible but synchronized with his own. Igor recorded the events, trying to rationalize what was happening. But the notes didn't help. Strange lines and marks appeared on the pages that he hadn't made, as if someone was leaving clues. He understood one thing. This wasn't just coincidence, not chance. The figure in the coat knew more than an ordinary person should know. One night, deciding to test himself, Igor went out onto the street using a different route, trying to walk through the park. The moon dimly lit the path, but the trees cast long shadows. And then he noticed it, the figure, standing at the other end of the path. It was motionless, but its presence felt like cold air piercing right through him. Igor froze, feeling his heart pounding in his chest, his palms sweating. He tried to move, take a step, and the figure repeated the movement as if playing with him. A panic grew. He tried to speed up, go around it, hide behind trees, but the figure always appeared where he wasn't looking. A feeling of hopelessness settled inside Igor. He understood that he couldn't hide, that any street corner, any hidden place, would still be within his pursuer's field of vision. Fear transformed into despair. He began thinking that there might be only one way, to confront the figure face to face, to understand what he was dealing with. But the attempt to meet the figure's gaze was terrifying. He approached closer, his heart beating wildly. The figure stood without moving, its hood concealing its face. Igor realized that this being didn't react to words, to movements, to pleas. It existed outside normal time and space, like a living manifestation of his fear. After that, Igor couldn't fall asleep. He remained in his apartment, watching the street. Even during the day, he felt the presence. A slight creak, a shadow flickering in his peripheral vision. Everything triggered panic fear. He began doubting his own sanity, but his rational side understood this being was real. It exists, and it watches. With each day, the nightmares grew longer, more vivid. He saw the figure in the coat standing in his room, sometimes copying Igor's movements, sometimes doing things he couldn't predict. It was everywhere and nowhere at once, and Igor began to realize that ordinary people didn't notice it. This was his personal shadow of terror, a being that knew everything about him and which would never let him go. Chapter 1, Nightwalker, Part 4. Igor decided he could no longer stay in his apartment. Every movement, every rustle, every glint of streetlight became a threat. He was going to leave the city, find a hotel or apartment in another part of a district, at least for a while, at least to feel safe. But even the thought of leaving brought no relief. He crept to the window to survey the street. In the darkness, it seemed empty, but every fleeting movement made his heart beat faster. Igor saw the familiar figure. The figure in the black coat stood by the distant street lamp, motionless but watchful. It seemed part of the shadow, yet somehow alive. Igor sat on the edge of the bed and pondered. Am I losing my mind? He asked himself. But his inner sense suggested this was no hallucination. He remembered details that were impossible to invent. The figure's reflection in the shop window, footsteps that matched his own, prints on the wet asphalt that he hadn't left. The next day he tried to distract himself with work, conversations with friends, calls to relatives. But every sound on the street, every creak of a door behind the wall, every knock, all of it brought back the feeling of being hunted. Even in crowded places, Igor felt the cold presence. He began changing his routes home. And each time the figure appeared again. Igor checked stores, alleys, streetlights, but always noticed it where he least expected. It became like a game. No matter how much he tried to hide, it always ended up nearby. At night, Igor heard footsteps outside his window. He rose, slowly approaching the curtains. There was no one on the street, but a shadow that flickered on the sidewalk made his heart jump. He understood. The figure was now playing with him, creating illusions. It knew his habits, knew where he would stand, how he would move, when he would blink. Attempting to call for help proved useless. Neither neighbors nor friends nor police could see the figure. It was invisible to everyone except him. Igor felt imprisoned in his own world, trapped by someone or something that didn't obey laws. Igor began recording every step of the figure, every sound, every movement. He understood that if he couldn't grasp the logic of the pursuit, it would never end. He analyzed every street corner, every streetlight, every reflection. But the more he analyzed, the clearer he understood there was no logic. This wasn't a person, not a creature that could be predicted. This was something greater, a shadow that lived on his fear. Every night he experienced nightmares in which the figure drew ever closer. It appeared in his apartment, on the street, in reflections of glass and shop windows. Sometimes it mimicked his movements, sometimes it did things he could never foresee. Waking up, he felt that fear remained with him, like a shadow he couldn't shake. Igor began to feel physical exhaustion. Sleep wouldn't come. His body trembled from constant tension, his heart beat faster at every sound. He tried talking to himself. This is all paranoia. But deep down he understood that the pursuit was real. This wasn't just a figure, not just a person. This was an entity living on his fear, feeding on his anxiety. The inner tension grew to its limit. He realized he could no longer hide. Any secluded corner, any empty space, it would all still become the figure's field of vision. Igor began to realize that the only way was to meet it face to face, understand what kind of being this was, and possibly find an escape or way to defend himself. Chapter 1. Night Passerby. Part 5. By morning, Igor had made his decision. No more running. He sat in the kitchen, staring at a cold cup of long, cooled tea. The early morning light barely penetrated through the curtains, blurring the edges of objects. Everything seemed unreal, as if the world had lost its sharpness, become a stage set. But one thing was sharp. The figure. It won't disappear. It won't leave him alone. That left only one option: meet it face to face. The thought seemed insane at first. His heart immediately responded with a heavy, painful thud. But the longer he thought about it, the clearer it became. He was already living in fear. It couldn't get worse. Igor stood up. His hands trembled slightly, but a strange resolve appeared inside him. He put on his coat, stopped at the door, and froze. Silence. The kind that presses on your ears. He opened the door. The stairwell greeted him with cold and the smell of dust. The ceiling lamp flickered, creating jagged light. Igor took a step, then another. Every sound echoed, too loud, too distinct. And then he heard it. Nist. Not his own. Igor stopped abruptly. Silence. He turned around. Empty. The staircase led up and down, disappearing into darkness. Must have imagined it, he whispered, but his voice sounded foreign. He went down to the first floor, stepped outside. The city was waking up, but still half empty. Few cars, few passers-by. The light seemed dim, as if night hadn't fully departed. Igor took a few steps and stopped. On the other side of the road, under a street lamp, stood a figure, the same one. Black coat, hood, stillness. Igor's heart clenched. But he didn't retreat. On the contrary, He took a step forward. The figure didn't move. Another step. And another. The distance was shrinking. The air became colder, denser, as if the world itself was trying to stop him. Igor felt goosebumps running along his skin, felt his breathing become heavy. But he kept walking. Now I'll see. A few more meters. He stopped. Now only a few steps separated them. The figure tilted its head slightly. It was the first conscious movement. Igor froze. Something snapped inside. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. There was no answer. But he felt that he'd been heard. The figure slowly raised its hand. The movement was unnatural, too smooth, too precise. Igor couldn't take it. He took another step forward and extended his hand, as if trying to touch. And in that moment, the figure repeated his movement. Exactly. Like a reflection. But with a delay. A split second later, Igor jerked his hand back, his heart pounding at breakneck speed. This is impossible. The figure took a step forward. The first step. Igor felt panic rising inside. He took a step back. The figure forward. And again, with that same strange delay. As if it wasn't just copying him, but learning. Igor began retreating faster. The figure sped up. Now its movements became more confident. Closer. Even closer. Igor spun around and ran. He didn't remember where exactly. Alleys, courtyards, roads, everything blended together. He heard only his breathing and footsteps behind him. The same ones. Rhythmic. Precise. Synchronized. He turned into a narrow courtyard, stopped, trying to catch his breath. Go. Silence. Igor turned around. No one. But inside was a clear sensation. It was near. He slowly looked up and froze. In the window across, on the second floor, there it stood, the figure, looking straight at him. Too high. Too fast. Impossible. Igor felt fear transforming into something else. Not just panic. Realization. This isn't human. In it, now closer than ever. Chapter 1, Night Passerby, Part 6. Igor didn't remember how he got home. Courtyards, turns, stairwells, everything blurred into one smeared stain. He seemed to move automatically, guided by some remnant of instinct that hadn't yet broken under the pressure of fear. When his apartment door slammed shut behind him, he leaned against it and slowly slid down. Silence. But now it was different. Not empty. Full. He sat there, trying to steady his breathing. His heart was still pounding, but no longer from running, from understanding. He had seen her up close. Too close. And the most terrifying thing wasn't how she looked, but how she moved. With delay. With repetition. With attempts to copy. Igor jerked his head up. The hallway was dark. He hadn't turned on the light. Why? He didn't remember. Slowly, very slowly, he stood up. Each step resonated through his body with tension. The floor creaked under his feet, and that sound seemed too loud, almost unnatural. He took another step, and at that moment he heard it. A creak. But not under his own foot. Behind him. Igor froze. Everything inside compressed. He didn't turn around. Couldn't. No, 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 the creak repeated. Exactly the same. With the same intonation. The same pause. As if someone was repeating his movement. Slowly, overcoming himself, Igor turned his head. Empty. Hallway. Wall. Coat rack. No one. But the feeling didn't disappear. It was nearby. Very close. Igor quickly flicked on the light. The yellow bulb flooded the hallway, driving away the shadows. Nothing. I'm going insane, he whispered. But his voice trembled. Because he knew that wasn't true. He slowly walked into the room and stopped. The mirror. Large, wall-mounted by the closet. He didn't remember leaving it like that. It was turned slightly different. Just a little. But enough so that he could see himself. Igor stepped closer. The reflection looked back at him. A tired face. Pale skin. Eyes that no longer held any peace. He raised his hand. The reflection did too. Everything normal? He exhaled. You're going insane. Just stress. Just fear. He took a step back. And at that moment, the reflection didn't immediately repeat the movement. A delay. Tiny. But it was there. Igor froze. His heart sped up again. No, he took another step. And another. This time, the delay was slightly more noticeable. The reflection was moving, not with him, but after. As if, learning, Igor quickly stepped back. The mirror reflected his movement with a lag. And then, the reflection stopped. Even though he kept moving, Igor froze, slowly raised his eyes, and saw that the reflection wasn't looking at him, but slightly higher, over his shoulder. Cold ran down his spine. He didn't want to. He shouldn't have. But he turned around. Empty. Well, bed. No one. He looked in the mirror again. The reflection was already looking at him, and now moving in sync, like before, as if nothing had happened. Igor stepped back another step. His hands were shaking. His breathing faltered. He understood. It wasn't just following him, not just appearing on the street. It was already here, inside, in his space, in his reflection, in his reality. The light in the room suddenly flickered. Once, twice, and went out. Darkness covered everything instantly. Igor froze. In this silence, he heard a footstep. In the room. Not his own. Very close. He didn't move. Even stopped breathing. A footstep. Another one. Slow. Heavy. And, with delay, as if first he moved. And then someone repeated. Igor closed his eyes. That was a mistake. Because in the darkness, he suddenly realized that now it didn't matter whether they were open or not. He could feel her. Right in front of him. Very close. Too close. Chapter 1. The Night Passerby, Part 7. The darkness in the room seemed alive. Igor stood motionless, as if any movement might provoke whatever was nearby. He couldn't see her, but he could feel it. This was worse than seeing. Presence. Dense. Dawned. Foreign. He slowly opened his eyes. 1. Darkness. But something was wrong. Too quiet. 2. Great. Igor took a cautious step backward. The floor creaked, and almost immediately, the creak repeated. Same note. Same pause. Good. Slightly later, his heart struck so hard he felt pain in his chest. No, he breathed. He sharply took another step. Creep. And again. Repeat. He turned around. No one. But the sound was there. It was real. Igor began moving faster. Step. Creak. Pause. Creak. Step. Creak. Pause. Geek. Rhythm. As if he wasn't alone in the room. As if someone was walking behind him and copying every movement. He rushed to the switch and flicked it sharply. Light flashed. The room lit up. Empty. But the feeling didn't disappear. On the contrary. Now it became clearer. It was inside the space. Igor sharply turned to the mirror and froze. The reflection was standing, looking at him. But he wasn't moving. And the reflection slightly tilted its head by itself without him. Igor recoiled. No, he raised his hand. The reflection repeated, with a delay, but this time, after the movement, it smiled. A light, barely noticeable, wrong smile. Not his. Not his at all. Igor screamed and stepped back. The mirror became ordinary again. The reflection copied him exactly, as if nothing had happened, as if it was just testing. Igor breathed heavily. His hands trembled. He understood. It was learning. First steps. Then movements. Now facial expressions. Next, he didn't want to think what would be next. He sharply turned away from the mirror, and in that moment noticed something else. His phone lay on the table. The screen was on, though he hadn't touched it. Igor slowly approached. A video was open on the screen. Camera. Recording. He pressed play and froze. And the video was him. In this room. A few seconds ago, he stood in the darkness, not moving, and then took a step, and behind him, in the darkness, something moved, with the same delay, the same figure, black coat, but now it was inside, right behind him, very close. Igor dropped the phone. The screen went dark. The room became ordinary again, but he no longer believed it. He slowly raised his gaze and realized that the room had become cramped, as if the space had compressed, as if there was one more in it. Igor took a step back and suddenly stopped. Because he had already taken this step, he clearly felt it, as if the movement had happened earlier, and now he was just repeating it. His heart stopped. No. He slowly raised his hand, and in that moment understood that he wasn't the first to do this. A split second earlier, someone had already raised it. Igor sharply lowered his hand. Panic covered him completely. Enough, he whispered. But his voice sounded weak, because he already understood the most terrifying thing. He no longer controlled everything first, but was doing it before him. And he was only repeating. Chapter 1, The Night Walker. Part 8. Igor no longer trusted his body. This feeling hadn't come all at once. First, as a strange thought, then as a suspicion, and now it had become a fact he could no longer turn away from. He stood in the middle of the room and tried not to move. Not a finger, not a glance, because every movement now seemed suspicious. Each one might not be his. The silence pressed down. The lamplight began flickering again. Once, twice. Igor closed his eyes. Don't move. Just don't move. He focused on breathing. He lies in, out, and suddenly he felt it. Movement. Light, almost imperceptible. The fingers of his right hand twitched. Igor snapped his eyes open. He hadn't moved his hand. He knew that for certain. But his fingers, if not, had clenched. By themselves. Cold ran through his entire body. No, he took a step back and froze. Because he didn't remember giving himself the command to move. It had happened on its own, or not on its own. Igor looked sharply into the mirror. The reflection stood there, looking at him. But no, it was moving slightly earlier. He raised his hand, but the reflection was already raising it. Before him, a second, a fraction of a second. But it was enough. That's not me. The reflection looked straight into his eyes. And this time, the smile appeared immediately, without delay, as if it was no longer learning. As if it already knew. Igor turned away sharply. Breathing became difficult. The room felt foreign, too narrow. Wrong. He walked to the door and froze. His hand settled on the handle. But he didn't remember how that had happened. He didn't remember deciding to leave. He didn't remember moving. Igor tried to pull his hand away. It didn't work. His fingers gripped tighter. The door slowly opened. Reek? That same sound. Familiar. Repeating. With a delay, Igor felt everything inside him snap. He no longer controlled this. Someone was doing it for him. He stepped out into the hallway. Himself, and not himself. The lamp flickered again. Step, leak, pause, creak, step. He walked down the stairs. Every movement, like it was pre-recorded, as if he was simply following an already written script. Igor tried to stop. It didn't work. His body kept moving, calmly, confidently, as if it knew where it was going. He stepped outside. Cold air hit his face, but it didn't help. His consciousness remained. A passenger. Igor raised his head and saw her. The figure in the black coat stood directly in front of him. But now, she wasn't copying. She was standing, waiting, as if all this time she had been leading him here. Igor wanted to scream, but no voice came out. His body took a step forward, on its own, another step. The distance was closing. The figure raised its head, and for the first time, Igor saw the face, and rose, because it was him, his face, his eyes, but empty, without emotion, without life, like a reflection that had become real. Igor felt his consciousness beginning to lag behind, as if he was no longer in his body, as if he was watching everything from the outside. The figure took a step. Now it was moving first. Igor following. Like a copy, like a shadow, like a reflection. The world around him began to blur. Sounds, muffled. Colors, dim. He understood. Too late. He wasn't the original, and perhaps hadn't been for a long time. Chapter 1, The Night Passerby. Part 9. Igor no longer felt his body. He could see. He could hear. He understood. but he wasn't in control. It was like a dream you can't wake up from. Only this wasn't a dream. This was worse. He stood before himself, before the one who now moved first. The figure in the black coat no longer seemed foreign. It was clear, real, solid. Every gesture was confident, complete. Igor, however, lagged behind. A split second. A moment. But that was enough to understand he was no longer the one in charge. The figure slowly turned and walked forward. Igor followed, without resistance, without choice. They walked down the street, but the city had changed. The streetlights glowed dimly, as if through water. Buildings seemed taller, shadows deeper. Space had become foreign, stretched, wrong. Step. The figure. Pause. Step. Igor. Rhythm. That same rhythm. From the very beginning. Now he understood. This was never a pursuit. This was replacement. The figure stopped. Igor did too. They stood in the middle of an empty street. The figure slowly turned its head and looked at him. Directly, without a hood, without shadow, his face. But now, with living eyes, with awareness, with presence. You, Igor tried to say, but no voice came out. The figure smiled, this time calmly, almost manly, and took a step toward him. Igor wanted to back away. He couldn't. His body wouldn't obey. The figure came close, too close. He could feel its breath, warm, living, real, and suddenly he understood. This breath should have been his, but now it no longer belonged to him. The figure slowly raised its hand, touched his face. Igor felt cold, and then emptiness, as if something was being drawn out, not physically, deeper. His consciousness began to crumble. Thoughts lost their shape. Memory slipped away. He tried to hold on, remember himself, his name, who he was, where he was. But everything dissolved, as if he was being erased, carefully, methodically, without pain. But with terror, the last thing he felt was a gaze. His own gaze. Quote, now, from the other side. And silence. Deep, absolute, empty. When Igor opened his eyes, he stood on the street. The night was peaceful. The streetlights shone evenly. The city looked ordinary. He inhaled, deeply, calmly, looked around. No one. Empty. As it should be. He adjusted his coat. Left. Warm. Comfortable. Took a step. And stopped. Because somewhere behind him, a sound rang out. A scrape. He didn't turn around, only smiled slightly, and walked on. You. Pause. Step. And somewhere behind, with the same delay, someone repeated.